Hello, this is Stephen Whitfield with Drilling Contractor. Today I'll be joined by Anton Rushikov, Senior Consultant at Global Affairs Associates. We'll be talking about the challenges drilling contractors face in developing ESG programs, particularly with regards to data. Mr. Rushikov gave a presentation on this topic at the 2021 IADC Sustainability Conference in February. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I understand that there are different meanings when a company says they're aiming to achieve net zero. Can you give us a brief primer around the difference between scopes 1, 2, and scope 3? And from your perspective, where should drilling contractors be focusing for their own net zero goals and why?
Well, of course, we hear a lot about companies now committing to achieving net zero and actually been providing timelines for that, 2040, 2050. And of course, there are many things that they may mean when they talk about net zero. So first, let me explain what the scopes 1, 2, and 3 are. So basically, scope 1 and 2 are so-called direct emissions and indirect emissions. So direct emissions are the emissions that come from fuel combustion. So let's say in case of drilling rigs, so the fuel that is combusted in diesel engine would go under scope 1. Scope 2 are indirect emissions that are basically electricity purchased. So this is electricity that comes from third-party sources. And scope 3 is basically everything else. Usually we talk about scope 3 emissions as product emissions. So in case of oil and gas companies, actually scope 3 is their largest scope because this is emissions associated with their products. But when we talk about drilling contractors, we typically focus on scope 1 emissions because this emissions is really where this is the main source of emissions for drilling contractors. On average, we estimate it's about 90 to 95% of all emissions in drilling come from fuel combustion. So that's why for drilling contractors, they need to focus on scope 1 emissions.
You said at the conference that one of the biggest challenges you see with drilling contractors' ESG programs is that they don't have reliable data to calculate their greenhouse gas emissions, that a lot of their calculations are really just estimates. Can you talk about why that is? What are the challenges around drilling contractors getting clean, reliable data here?
Well, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and there is a big challenge with data, and it actually has to do with the established practice in the oil and gas industry, and in particular how drilling contractors working with their customers. So it's a common practice for customers to provide fuel, and actually drilling contractors, when they perform their on contract, they don't really have any data on fuel because they don't have to deal with this, right? So data is done with the customers, and in fact, there is such a thing as captive service. Definition is that the operator would count emissions associated with, for example, drilling operators work as their own emissions, even though they don't own the asset, and then they would report them externally. So when we talk about reporting greenhouse gas emissions, the important area there is so-called operational boundary. It's basically where you draw the boundary of your responsibility for the emissions. And because of this practice of when customers are providing fuel, so basically for drilling operators, their operational boundary and operational boundary definition is that where you have operational control, where you can have ability to change, right, something. So for drilling contractors, when they cannot influence, what kind of fuel they're using, basically it means that they're not responsible for emissions that are associated with the fuels. And as I mentioned before, it's about 90 to 95% of all the emissions. And that's where the challenge is that if you're a drilling contractor, you really want to know what your emissions are. And also you want to see how all these investments that are being made into improving efficiency, into reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of work that's been done, investment in dual fuel engines, natural gas, Tier 4. So you name it, there are a lot of things that, companies are doing. I mean, drilling contractors are doing. But unfortunately, because they don't have the data, they can't capture all the improvements and all the greenhouse gas reductions that they actually achieving through these investments.
Considering the challenges you just mentioned, as well as the importance of having such data in order to quantify results and demonstrate the value of investments in ESG, what are some of the first steps that a drilling contractor can take to get better data?
Well, I think the first step to be taken is to take kind of a holistic view on greenhouse gas emissions, because of course, when we guided by guidance from Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we follow strict definition of operational boundaries, then of course, and with the practice, as I explained, established in the industry, that typically customers, the operators, would report emissions. So of course, the first, and for drilling contractors say, because I'm not really responsible for those emissions, I don't really need to account for them. So, and I think so the first step is actually to say, no, at least I need to understand my greenhouse gas emissions. Even though they may be reported by somebody else, it's still, I at least need to account for them, right? And that's where you can distinguish between accounting and reporting, because you can, at least when you account for emissions, when you have your inventory of all the greenhouse gas sources, then at least you know what's your footprint, even though part of this footprint is being reported by somebody else. So I think that's the first step. And the second step is really about once you know what your boundary is, then it is important to understand how you get the data. And because most of the data actually, the customers, they do have this data. So it is important actually to start this dialogue with them on being able to have access to the data, and maybe sort of have some kind of collaboration around how this data can be shared. Because what you also don't want to do, you don't want to double reports your greenhouse gas emissions. So again, it has to be a discussion about the operation boundary between the operators and the drilling contractors. But just to say it again, so holistic view. So it's like, it is time because net zero is going to stay, companies, oil and gas companies will be looking for ways to cut their emissions, and it's going to happen across the whole supply chain. So all, third-party providers will be contributing to this, right? And again, if the challenge is that you're making all these investments and you don't know, what kind of efficiency gains you get from that, I think it's a challenge, it's a problem that has to be addressed. But a way to address it is really for contractors to work with operators and find a way how they can exchange the data and how they can sort of work together, and maybe to change the practice in the way how fuel data is provided to drilling contractors.
Well, Mr. Rushikov, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. Sustainability should be a major priority for drilling contractors moving forward, and it'll be interesting to see how they tackle these issues surrounding the use of data and data optimization in this space. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for visiting Drilling Contractor.